Imagine this, you have decided you're going to learn a new language. You look up all of these amazing people online and see how they've learned this language really fast. And then you feel like, okay, I need to learn this language within 3, 4, 5 months. And once you start learning, being a beginner from knowing nothing to knowing something to knowing a lot, that curve is really, really high, right? From knowing 0 to knowing at least how to introduce yourself. After that, once you're past beginner, once you're past intermediate, you start to plateau. That is where you need focus and discipline. The language is not going to be fun the whole time. You are going to get tired, discouraged, frustrated. A lot of people ask me, do you ever feel, frustrated in your language learning? Do you ever want to give up? Yes, all the time, It's not just a honeymoon journey. But what you need to do when you feel like I'm not making progress is really to have focus and discipline. If setting a language learning schedule is the way for you to go, by all means do it. If you need to change up your routine, try that. If you want to pause on that language and learn another one, it's okay. Remember why you're doing this. You are learning a language for the point of communication and for yourself. You're not out there to prove yourself to the world. This language learning is a very, very personal journey. Another thing I want to touch on about focus is within specific study sessions. People spend so much time making their notes look so beautiful and aesthetically pleasing for their Instagram posts that they're not actually getting a lot of studying done. I've seen this in myself, study groups, and people have admitted it online, and that is a really negative thing. You are wasting precious time that you could spend learning new words and grammar structure. Not everything you do needs to be posted online. Not everything you do needs to be beautiful. Just do it, learn more, and surprise people with your progress later. And point number 5 is faith. I just wrote faith because it's another F, but this is also like belief in yourself. Belief that language learning is possible. It is possible to learn a language at an older age. It is possible to learn 2, 3, 4 languages at the same time. It is possible to get a native sounding accent over time. Nothing is impossible if you put your mind to it. Just have faith in yourself.
I'd be really interested to hear you guys discuss this topic at length and ask Lindie how she handles learning multiple languages at the same time. You cannot unfortunately discuss it at length, but I'm pretty sure that Lindie can give a concise answer.
I think people often interpret polyglot as someone who is learning multiple languages all at once from the same level. Like beginner, you're starting 12 languages and you're learning them all. Absolutely not. I started with English, was my first foreign language actually. Then I slowly learned French at school, and then Arabic became a school subject. And only in like my grade 10 year of high school, I started learning Korean. It's been 10 years for Korean. Halfway through Korean, I started learning Japanese. Halfway through learning Japanese, it was Chinese. And thereafter, little things like Vietnamese, Spanish, Hungarian, and Tagalog came along. So it has been like 20-ish years of language learning where I'm slowly building up languages on each other. None of my languages are completely beginner starting at the same time. It's always a little bit like stacking and focusing maybe years or months on one language before I learn another language. It's really a lifelong thing. I think people who kind of become interested in the polyglot world, they might be starting at 1 or 2 languages and their goal is to become a polyglot, and you think you need to learn all these languages at once, but you don't realize that you need to slow down a little and consider how many years and how many months it takes really to learn a language. The other thing that you were mentioning is kind of like the system I have. So I choose maybe 1 or 2 focus languages for a set period of months or weeks, and then I integrate it into my day. So I might do Vietnamese and Hungarian lessons twice a week for 3 months, and then for the next set of 3 months, I might be focusing on another language. So it's really just prioritizing, and none of my languages really are starting from 0 at the same time.
Fantastic answer. But Lindie, I wanted to ask you, do you have does your method, do you have a fixed path towards language learning, towards every single language you learn when you learn from scratch? And do you think that the structure or the idiosyncrasies or some features of certain languages kind of dictate or make you tweak the method or the methodology that you have already adopted?
I think for my languages, I have a general timeline or mindset that I use for every language. So knowing that I need to start with the basic greetings and then the sentence structure, and filling in, kind of having one sentence structure that I say, for instance, I like verb, and then I like verb with someone, and I like verb with someone in place. So I create these little sentences for myself at the very beginning of a language. So in terms of knowing what I want to learn by when, my structure is the same, but like you said, the idiosyncrasies or the grammar of a language does dictate a different approach, especially the word order. So it's a lot easier for me to understand languages that are similar to languages I've learned otherwise. Whereas with Hungarian, for instance, that has quite a flexible word order, it might give, I might require a lot more time to understand the complex grammar and the word order of that. So it means that there's no cookie cutter technique because it depends on a lot of factors. As well, if you're learning a language that has a different writing system, for instance, Mandarin Chinese, you're going to have to dedicate, if you want, a lot of time to learning how to read and write these characters. It's not just an alphabet you can learn once and then you can read even if you don't know the meaning. If you don't know how to read it and you don't know the meaning, So definitely a different approach according to the script of the language and the grammar. If you already understand the sentence structure and the grammar, there's no need to dedicate a lot of time reviewing grammar notes when you already understand it. So it depends on how difficult the language is and how similar it is to languages you've learned before.
How long did it take you to actually be able to express yourself freely in Korean? Fantastic question. Again, as I always say, it depends. It depends on what you consider freely express. For me, I would say the turning point was really around the 2.5-year mark. This might sound really long for some people, but that was really where I remember there was this distinct moment where I was like, oh my goodness, I understood everything this person said. And without needing to think, what's the word, or translate in my head, I was able to just have it flow. It could be much faster for you if you're immersing yourself a lot more, and it could also be very slow if you are not practicing Korean. So don't use my example of 2.5 years as like, okay, by 2.5 years, I need to be comfortable to speak. You could reach there in like 9 months or 5 years. Again, it depends. But I remember I was at a Korean festival. It was like a food festival. Somebody was asking me about like how long I've been learning Korean, why I'm interested in it. Of course, these are topics that I was able to talk about easily. Talking about why I'm learning Korean, it was something I'd been practicing a lot. Like, people would always ask me, like, why are you learning Korean? And I'd been able to answer that question so many times, like, 그냥 취미니까 한국말도 배웠어요. These kinds of phrases I've been using a lot. Number one, because the topic was easy for me, talking about why I'm learning Korean, I was able to feel really fluid. If somebody was asking me about politics or history in Korean, even now, at my level after learning for a decade, I would be like, ooh, I don't really know the words. So can you really say that I can express my thoughts freely in Korean? Yes, for some topics, but for other topics, not so much. And that's the beauty of learning a language. There's always going to be more and more that you can learn. Things that make it difficult for you to start learning, and reasons why people fail to learn or struggle to continue. I'm going to start by talking about the perception that people have of multilinguals or successful language learners. When I see people just starting out in language learning, talking to people who have learned a few languages, something that often comes up are questions like, how did you learn all of these languages? And then they go and say, you must have some kind of magic talent. You were born this way. But people don't actually realize it's not luck or talent or magic to speak multiple languages. It's really time, effort, skill, motivation, discipline, consistency, community, immersion, all of these factors that contribute to successfully being able to learn a language. And then the next obstacle to progressing towards fluency is people learning unnecessary things at the wrong time when learning a language. If you're just starting out and you don't know much, let's say you're reading a piece of text or watching a video, there are going to be so many new words that you don't know, and you might feel like, I have to write them all down. I have to make flashcards of all of these. I have to know everything because I don't understand anything. No, you don't need to learn every single new word there is because you might not use them immediately. Rather learn through natural daily conversations. Another thing I'll say that you should be wary of is not over-planning your language timeline and the resources you use. And something that always comes up is, I think people are always looking for the best method to learn a language, and they over-plan, they think so hard, and they're not actually starting to learn a language right away. Now, the reason I think this happens is that on YouTube, on forums online, we are so overwhelmed and bombarded by information of people saying, this is the best way to learn a language. This is the fastest way to learn. And we think that it's kind of impossible to start learning a language if we haven't perfected our method and our schedule. About 10 years ago, when I started learning Korean, this wasn't really the case. We didn't have, did Instagram exist back then? If Instagram existed, it was like, there was no language community there. So I just sort of went into it kind of blindly, and I still managed to learn Korean to a pretty decent level. But now I think we're trying so hard to find the perfect method instead of actually just starting. Again, like I always say, when I started Korean, Japanese 10 or 8 years ago, I didn't have a lot of resources. In South Africa, we had like 2 Japanese textbooks in the entire store. If I had gone and been like, oh my gosh, which textbook do I need? What's the best method? What's the fastest way to learn? I would have been wasting time instead of starting with the little that I did have. So I just used like one textbook. I had one person I could talk to, and I built it up from there. I recommend you not to overplan, not to think, oh, what is the best way to learn? Just start with what you have. So I've spoken about chunking before, but it's an awesome habit you can adapt to look at how you learn vocabulary differently. My next habit is to simplify. My friend Jonathan Siebald from Siebald Speaks on YouTube, he made a video about deleting all his language apps, which is a crazy idea, but I totally understand where he's coming from. There's just too much out there, and sometimes it's good to just pick one thing to stick with. I have found that I've been deleting language apps over the years once I find one that really works for me. So I've cleaned up my phone a lot. So even though I have a bunch of Korean textbooks, when I'm focusing on preparing for something, I try and use just one textbook and complete that to the full. For Spanish right now, what I'm just doing is working through some articles on design, and after that I'm going to start with some textbooks. There are definitely ways that are not going to be effective in your language learning journey. I mean, if you're just starting out and you do a Google search on how to learn a language, probably one of the first things you're going to see is Duolingo and Rosetta Stone. While these are pieces of software that can be beneficial and helpful to your language learning journey, you should not use these things thinking that you're going to get fluent just by interacting with this. Language learning comes from hearing the language, by interacting with native speakers, by reading content, by writing journals, by practicing your speaking. Just by using one app, you're not going to get to a level where you want to be at, which is essentially fluent. What I mean by there's a wrong way to learn a language is there's a wrong way to approach the method that you already have. If you are dead set focused on just learning vocabulary, for instance, and you're ignoring grammar, you're not practicing your speaking, you're not getting a holistic approach to language learning, then you are not going to improve as fast as you could be. Language learning is all about the input. You need to get comprehensible input. So something I do when I'm learning a language is I try and apply it to my job, which is a UI UX designer. So I'm always looking up articles in Spanish or Korean, or listening to design podcasts that can help me improve my vocabulary in spheres that are relevant to my life, and of course bound to be words that I'm going to use a lot. So I just Googled it, and comprehensible input is a hypothesis that says comprehensible input is language input that can be understood by listeners despite them not understanding all the words and structures in it. So this goes back to the question I received on Tumblr, which is, I've been watching children's cartoons lately because I find them entertaining and easy to understand and learn, given I'm a complete beginner. But a friend always says that that's a dumb idea. First of all, that's not a nice thing of your friend to say, because clearly this person is finding that by watching cartoons they are able to learn because they are getting comprehensible input. Don't let cartoons be the only way you're learning this language. Remember to take from a whole bunch of different sources. Have a vocabulary book or some, app to learn vocab on. Have some way that you can learn grammar, but keep getting this comprehensible input where you can hear the words that popped up. Something I do is I don't review my notes a lot. I don't go over old vocab words and try and memorize. I kind of just hope that by all the input I'm getting from the language, that those words will pop up somewhere. So the more exposure you get to the language, the more you can solidify these words and grammar structures that you have at least learned once or twice. Something else I want to touch on is your mindset about language learning. I've made a video about this, which I think will be very helpful for you, because a lot of how we learn a language is how we think about learning. If you're constantly focusing about, I'm so scared to make mistakes, I'm so scared to be speaking to native speakers, you are adopting this mindset of fear, and you're going to associate language learning with something that is very scary and intimidating. It's okay, it takes a while for us to get over that hurdle of fear, but once we change our mindset, the way we learn languages is going to improve. Watching this video about a guy's weight loss journey, and at the end of the video it said something like, since success is definite, what would you do? Or now that you know success is a definite thing, what will you do to get there? So also change your mindset about how you think about language learning. You will succeed if you put in this input. Research some language learning techniques which are applicable to your situation and your learning style. But the most important thing is just being consistent, having a positive mindset, and getting comprehensible input. So if that means watching cartoons, that's okay. At least you are hearing the language. We can look at tracking your language process in two ways. The first one is your actual progression from beginner to advanced onwards. And the second aspect of tracking language learning is actually what are you doing to study this language? What kind of immersion are you incorporating into your language learning? What kind of tools are you using? Tracking your language learning activities and progress, why is this important? Well, for one, it gives you a visual representation of how much time or effort you've actually been spending on your languages. If you are creating a plan to study for an exam, for instance, it's a nice way to see how far you still have to go and to look back on how much you've done. Now, it's up to you whether you want to track the amount of hours you spend. There are people who have Excel spreadsheets where they log exactly how many up to the minutes they've spent on language learning. If this works for you, great. I don't really see the benefit in tracking minutes because it puts a lot of pressure on my language learning. Otherwise, if you just want to see what activities you're doing, you can use a general calendar view. So I can show you a little bit more of how I use this notebook. It's just a calendar, a small year planner from Muji, but you can use a blank notebook. So I have a monthly view here where I track what lessons I have in which language. I also track my books in general, like what books I'm reading when. And I have also set a goal for myself to write diary entries in my 2 focus languages every Sunday. So I just indicate those with these 3 lines. I have an indicator on the side here for the languages I'm learning, and I just add them in once I do them. So I'm not writing all my list of languages, but just Korean because I've done something in Korean. I watched a movie. Spanish is this red dot, so these are when I'm taking Spanish lessons or using Busuu. And I've got my diary entries here. I write them on Sundays. Sometimes I'm a little late, so this one's on Tuesday. I've just indicated what I did. When I don't do something, I put it in there as well. And then my little essays. I do get corrections and I write them in my language learning notebook. And I also just indicate what languages I've actually touched on this week. So if you set up a language learning journal where you're tracking what you do, you can see that maybe you planned on watching videos and listening to podcasts and reading books, but you're actually only watching videos. Then you can adjust your plan going forward. It's okay if you're not doing what you originally intended to do. The point of tracking your progress is to see either where you need to be a bit more strict on yourself or where you just need to let things go. It's okay if you're not following your original plan. I do want to emphasize, looking at the amount of time you spend learning a language is not going to make you fluent. It's what you do with the language in that allocated time that is really important. But for me, as a visual person who loves data, I like to track my language learning. I use an app to time where my time goes, and it's sort of a different way. Instead of saying I want to do 10 hours of Hungarian this week, I just say, I love Hungarian, I'm gonna learn Hungarian, let's see how much time I actually do spend on it. And then I adjust my plans accordingly to maybe how I feel, what new languages are exciting to me, and so forth. And then here's just a messy page from my notebook. At the end of a quarter, I will evaluate my goals, see how it went, count how many hours I've done on italki, learning a language. I'll write a little report of how my language learning went, and sometimes I might even write that report in a different language, like in French. So that's a way to practice my learning, plus also be more mindful and analyze how my language learning has gone. This thinking comes from what I do at work. So I'm a product designer and we work in the Agile methodology. That means we have sprints. One sprint is 2 weeks, and we have a certain number of sprints within a quarter to complete features that lead to an eventual goal. And it is called Agile because you can go back and change things and say, actually, this is taking longer than we thought, or this, we tried it, we released it, and users don't like it, so we're gonna roll it back and adjust. You don't plan for the entire year and do something and then have it fail at the end. So it's okay to have little failures and learnings along the way so that you can adjust every single sprint. But what I'm getting at is that if you are tracking your progress in little increments, you can make changes accordingly. That is also why I made my language learning plan in quarters and not for the entire year. So let's look at the second framework, which is Agile. Agility, right? You're constantly moving, you're changing things. Agile is iterative and cyclical and collaborative. This is how we work at startups. So let's say you have a product like an app, let's say the property search app that I work for right now. Then we have small features, or rather we have big goals that we want to achieve every quarter. And then from those big goals, we create small subtasks. And then from those subtasks, we say, which one is the most important to work on? Which is going to bring me the best value right now? And then we work on those in a sprint. A sprint is generally 2 weeks. So how might I be using an Agile methodology in my language learning? Is retrospectives. So what we do as a team after every feature is we have a little retro meeting where we say what went well, what didn't go well, and what I have learned. So I try and use an Agile approach to my language learning. For me, language learning is just a hobby. I want to make sure that my processes, language learning resources, and methods will help me learn in a fun and fast manner. So what I did this year is I split my language learning goals into quarters. So that's how we work, in corporate or in tech, you have your goals for quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3. And I said, okay, for the first quarter of the year, I'm going to focus on Hungarian and Spanish. And then I'm going to look back at the end of each quarter and do little mini retrospectives with myself to improve my processes. I'm very open and public about my processes. I'm not scared to make mistakes online, and I'm very open about sharing my progress. So on my YouTube channel, instead of saying, 12 languages for a whole year, I have shorter videos which says, hey, this is how it's going with my language learning. It's been going great. It's been going terrible. Here's my progress. I invite you to look into my journal as well. And then I set a lot smaller goals for myself instead of big, vague goals. Again, Twitter, my favorite place on the internet. I have a thread on Twitter where I keep track of my language learning goals for every quarter. And I'm also open to changing that as I go along. So you'll see here, quarter 1, I had my main foci, which were Tagalog and Hungarian. But as you can see, as I go along, I give updates. For instance, I realized I can't do 1 chapter of a book a week. I can do 1 chapter a week, not just 2 chapters in a month. So I change my plan as I go along. I'm being agile with my language learning.
How did you get over, if you did get over, nice one, being self-conscious about your Korean accent? Very good question, super valid. 2 things here. Number 1, actually working on your accent. And number 2, just accepting yourself for who you are and not letting fear get to you. So the first thing you can do is just realize that this is going to take time. You're not going to sound like a native. I don't even sound like a native after 10 years. Up your listening and speaking exposure, and over time, you'll ease naturally into it. The other thing you can do is really look into how do you position your mouth to pronounce certain words. It took me a very long time to tell the difference between "aw" and "o," and I had to have someone explain to me that "aw," you kind of open your jaw, "aw," and "o" is really rounded. So you can go into maybe tutorials that you can find on how to really be positioning your mouth to pronounce these words. So that's the sort of technical side. The other side of the coin is making peace with the fact that you are not a native speaker. It's natural to have your beautiful Caribbean accent when you're speaking Korean. This is absolutely normal. So what you can do is just focus on a mindset shift. Really dive into it and ask yourself, why is this so distressing to me? Have people laughed at me?
Am I worried what people are thinking of me? And ask yourself, why is that bothering you, or where the source of that worry comes from. Specific to me, I never really worried so much about my accent because I knew that over time it would ease out. And for me, the point was being able to communicate. So even if I didn't sound very natural, at least I was learning and able to get my ideas across. The more I studied, the more confident I felt, regardless of what my accent was like. And one metaphor that I thought of this morning is probably not the greatest metaphor. I'm not very creative with that. But what I was reminded of is, think of yourself in like an orchestra and you're practicing clarinet, for instance. If you're in your room at home practicing, you're practicing the same piece over and over and over. But once you're in that actual situation of playing in the orchestra with lots of other people working together, you might get stuck. It just feels completely different. So we can be working on our listening skills in isolation by listening to something over and over. Once we're put into a real life situation, like talking to somebody, we might feel, this is completely different from my experience listening to the language. There will be slang, people will speak at different speeds, there will be liaisons between words, different accents. You need to experience the language and listen to the language in a number of different varied contexts. And that is really what's going to help you improve your listening in the long run. First of all, let us talk about where you can encounter new vocabulary words. First way you can get new vocabulary is watching movies, watching dramas, TV shows, listening to the radio, and listening to music. So those all fall under immersion. I would underline the word that I'm learning and write its meaning above it so I can learn the word in context. It's always better to learn a new vocabulary word in context than it is to look at long word lists and just learn singular words. You remember a sentence like, "Where is the bathroom?" a lot faster than you do just the word where and bathroom, right? That's why phrase books are so useful when you go traveling. You don't learn a bunch of single words, you learn sentences. So on that note, learning a word in context from the book is a great idea. Next, we're going to talk about shopping lists and diaries and planners. I always write my shopping list in a different language, especially if I need to buy something completely new, like, I don't know, asparagus, and I don't know that word, for example. I will look it up and make sure to write asparagus on my list. It'll force me to remember the word, because if I go to the shop and I don't know what I wrote there, I'm doomed. So making shopping lists is a great way to reinforce and remember vocab words. Similarly, you can use your diary or planner and change it into your target language planner. If you have a meeting, for example, instead of writing meeting in English or your native language, you could write it in your target language. Chunking is learning entire set phrases rather than little vocabulary words out of context. We remember words a lot better when they are in context of a phrase, especially something that is related to something we are interested in. That's why how I'm learning Spanish right now is just going through like articles to do with design or watching TV shows I like and memorizing or learning set phrases. We are provided with so many resources and textbooks and apps out there that we want to self-study, but sometimes you get to a point where you feel like I just need someone else's guidance. During times like stressful times like now, when I have my full-time job to do, when I have videos to make, when I have other languages to study, kind of relying on a teacher or a tutor to help me and for me to be teachable, I feel like it's just removing a lot of mental strain from my side to think like, what should I teach myself today, and just hand it over to the tutor so that she can tell me what to do. If you've learned a language to some kind of intermediate level, took a long break and then came back to it. So we're gonna dive into that today. I want to start off by saying that you are in a good position. All of the material that you've learned before, it's still somewhere. German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus has something called the forgetting curve. I've mentioned this in a few videos before. If you are re-engaging with material you've learned before, it's going to take you less time to relearn it than it did for you to learn it from scratch. If you forget material and you relearn it the second time, it's more likely to be ingrained much deeper in your memory. I would recommend not taking a level test and buying a textbook and starting from scratch. I would say start with where you left off, go back over everything that you have, and slowly ease into the language. It's also stressful if you want to get a textbook and you don't know which one to get, because a beginner one will be too easy for you and an intermediate or advanced one might be way too difficult. So start with what you have. What I do when I try and get back into a language is look at the notes I have and take a highlighter or a pencil and go through it page by page and see which words do I not remember. Here is the exact notebook I used when I took the Lingota Sprint the year before. And as you can see, there are some highlights here in yellow and red, and that is me just going through my notes a few months after having taken them. So what I do is I just highlight useful phrases that I may have forgotten and transfer this to another notebook. The next thing that I would recommend is to take a course or to get a tutor. After focusing a lot on Hungarian and Tagalog at the beginning of this year, I thought, ooh, I need to brush up on my Spanish. So I did book quite a few group lessons for Spanish, and it was so nice to just be in the environment of a group lesson and be with people who are interested in the language. And everything is in Spanish, and you'll be surprised how much you're able to learn when you're taking lessons in the target language. Something that really helps me to get back into the French mode is just by listening to a lot of French. I'll listen to a lot of podcasts, or I will watch a series on Netflix in French. And it surprises me every time how much more fluidly I'm able to speak French after just having listened to it. It's not like I've lost all of the vocabulary, but I may have forgotten some useful phrases that I knew. And these things will come out in the podcasts you listen to or the movies you watch, and it'll be a nice refresher for you. I also recommend just finding a friend, someone you can reach out to again to have a very casual conversation, and this could be a language exchange partner, a new person, or it can be a friend you've had for a long time. Now the last thing, the most important thing, if you take one thing away from this video, it's to break up your language learning into very, very small micro goals. For instance, let's take Tagalog for example, the language that I am constantly putting on pause and forgetting. I have a textbook which is really, really wonderful. And what I did at the beginning of this year was to look at all of the chapters in the book I have, set aside some time for myself, whether that be 2 months, and then decide how many chapters I need to do a week or a month to finish the book. Like I said in the beginning of this video, that didn't happen, and that is because I set too high of a goal. I told myself to do 1 chapter a week, and it didn't work out because I'm really focusing on my design career right now. I'm working to improve my UX skills, leading the design team. I'm also learning Hungarian, and I want to brush up on my French. So looking at my life entirely, all of the aspects of my life outside of language learning, there's really no time for me to do 1 entire chapter a week. So I figured if I tell myself to do 1 chapter every 3 weeks, there will be a lot more leeway. Don't just follow my schedule, see how much time you are able to dedicate, and break your goal into much smaller pieces.
You can always practice a language when you write something and ask native speakers online for corrections. Again, this is not having a native speaker in your area who you're meeting in person, but you are making use of the wonderful world of the internet to get someone to help you. Whenever I write something and I want a native speaker to correct it, I usually go to one of 5 places. The first is Instagram. If you are following native speakers or people in the language community, feel free to just post something you wrote and say, hey, I'm open to corrections, can you help me? You can also do that on Twitter. Twitter has a really huge language learning community. A lot of people do also write in their Twitter bios open to corrections. So you can do that too. And when you post something in your native language, likely there will be people who can help you. The third app I like to use is Hi Native. Again, not sponsored, but I talk about this app all the time because I've used it for like 10 years. Have they been around that long? I don't know, but it's great. So basically you can just post something and say like, is this correct? And people will be like, yes it is, or no it's not, fix it for you. Hello Talk also has a feature where you can post something. And tip number 5 is to follow native speakers on social media. You just need to put yourself out there. You could live in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and if you have access to the internet, you are bound to meet native speakers. There is no excuse. Whenever I learn a language, I make a point of following native speakers or at least searching for content in a language. So I might be interested in web development, for instance. What I can do on Twitter or Instagram is search the hashtags in a particular language. If someone has posted about web development, I might reply to their tweet or comment on their post, and there I am interacting with native speakers. This is a bit of an unorthodox way because you're not guaranteed an answer from them,
but it's still giving you an opportunity to engage with native content and to practice your speaking or writing. And if native speakers aren't available, you can also learn from fellow language learners on different forums. Usually language apps have forums. StudyGram community on Tumblr, Twitter, and Instagram is really huge. So just search around the hashtags there, and then you have ways to meet people who are also learning the language. Bottom line as well is remember that this is supplementary to your language study. You need to consider language learning in a holistic approach. So that is using different apps, resources, textbooks, practicing your listening, your writing, your vocabulary, your grammar, and then practicing your speaking. And be open to corrections. Don't be shy when people are fixing your mistakes for you.
Do you use teachers? Do you think that teachers are important? And if so, how do you interact with your tutor?
There's a few people who, community tutors sometimes, who they just chat to you and they don't actually know how to teach a language. So if you have a teacher who actually knows how to structure a lesson and teach grammar, it's a lot easier than kind of just doing a language exchange. So I think teachers are important to some extent when you are very serious about the language and when it's a difficult language that you cannot really teach yourself. There will always be topics that for you to talk about. It can be boring if you have nothing to talk about, which is why it's important to have a professional teacher who knows what they're doing rather than a language partner who you have nothing in common.
How do you motivate yourself to remember words? What brings you back for motivation? I have many videos and blog posts about motivation, so I will leave you to watch those videos, but I'll just say at the top of my head, remembering why you started and looking back on your progress. Whenever I feel demotivated, I go back and say, hey, 5 or 10 years ago, I couldn't say anything, and now I am able to communicate. So congratulate yourself for the progress that you are making and tell yourself that the hard work does pay off, even if you don't see it in the short term. Number 2, try and figure out why I am not motivated. Is it because I'm tired? Is it because the content is too hard for me? Is it because I'm burnt out? Figure out what is the source of your lack of motivation and tackle that. If you're just exhausted, take a break. There's no shame in taking a break from the language and coming back to it later. The other approach is just taking a break, waiting it out, and slowly easing back into it. You need to be expanding what you listen to in different contexts. So if we listen to the same piece, we're only going to know those phrases and those vocabulary words in that context of the, let's say, podcast, for instance. I'm only going to know the phrase as a phrase that popped up in that podcast. I'll know what it means, but I need to experience it in different situations. If, however, if I do expand my listening to watching a lot more movies, listening to more podcasts, having a lot more conversations with people, like I always say, speaking and listening go hand in hand. A few more thoughts regarding listening. Another thing I want to take note of is that sometimes we approach listening like we do reading, intensive reading, right? So there's extensive reading and there's intensive reading where you're really engaging with a text. If you're focusing too much on individual specific words, you're not going to get the gist of listening. And why I think that could be a problem is if you're in a real situation with somebody and you're talking to them, you can't pause the conversation. Of course, you can interrupt them and say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Can you repeat it? But you're not able to sit there with a notebook and write down everything they say and pause the conversation. This works if you're at a language exchange and that's what you do. But in daily life, if your goal in language learning is to communicate with people, you need to get used to getting to a point where you just understand the gist of it. So for many years in Korean, I was able to understand like 80% of a conversation. And I didn't let that bother me because I was still able to communicate. I got the gist. I was able to listen around and get the gist of it. Like sit in that discomfort of not understanding everything and up your exposure to the language. Listen a lot, and it will just start to make sense. Over time is the key. So that's also why I don't like to isolate listening as one skill that I need to sharpen and work on. It's immersion, it's conversations with people, it's exposing yourself to the content, it's expanding your vocabulary in different contexts, because if you up your vocabulary, you will up your understanding of listening pieces, right? You can't just study from listening. I think the bottom line is that we need variety in what we listen to.
What do you think about curiosity and multilingualism? Do you think that makes it sort of bigger?
Sure. Oh, you have to be curious to really appreciate a language. I was giving a talk for a few diplomats, you know, really serious politicians, and they had a language academy at the Department of Foreign Affairs in South Africa, and so many of the people just approached it as like, well, okay, you know, I'm being sent to this country. I guess I have to learn this language, but I really don't care. Let me just complete my homework and be done. There was no cultural curiosity of like, I really want to know, why do people do this? Or, man, this food is amazing, I want to learn more about that. So yes, curiosity is a big beneficial skill that will help you learn a language. Language learning is not just techniques and methods and like the fastest way to learn this. It's a lot of principles. I have one video where I talk about like the 4 F's of language learning. It's fearlessness, fun, flexibility, and with that comes like curiosity and adaptability. There are a few like intangible skills that help you learn languages too.